New Cold Wars. This video is based on key insights from the book New Cold Wars by David Sanger. Chapter 1. The period in the early 2000s marked a significant turning point in the relationship between the United States and Russia, as David Sanger notes. This era was marked by a series of events that ultimately led to a deterioration in relations between the two nations. The invasion of Georgia in 2008, for instance, was a significant moment in this decline, as it marked a clear example of Russia's aggression and its willingness to use military force to achieve its goals. According to David Sanger, the Bush administration's response to the invasion was limited, and the United States continued to purchase oil from Russia, with imports increasing from 170 million barrels in 2008 to 223 million in 2010. This response, or lack thereof, set a pattern for how the West would react to Russian aggression in the years that followed. The Obama administration, which took office in 2009, attempted to reset relations with Russia, but this effort was ultimately unsuccessful. David Sanger points out that the reset policy was based on the idea that the United States and Russia could cooperate on areas of mutual interest, such as counterterrorism and nonproliferation. However, this approach was flawed, as it failed to account for the deep-seated suspicions and mistrust that existed between the two nations. The Russian government, led by Vladimir Putin, was determined to assert its influence and protect its interests, and it saw the United States as a threat to its goals. The rise of China also played a significant role in the decline of U.S.-Russia relations, as David Sanger notes. The United States was increasingly focused on the challenge posed by China, and it saw Russia as a secondary concern. However, this approach underestimated the threat posed by Russia, which was determined to reassert its influence in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine are just two examples of Russia's aggressive behavior in recent years. David Sanger argues that the West's failure to respond effectively to Russian aggression has emboldened Putin and created an environment in which he feels free to pursue his goals without fear of consequences. The lack of a strong response to the invasion of Georgia, for example, sent a signal that the West was not willing to stand up to Russia, and this has had far-reaching consequences. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the increasing tensions between Russia and the West are just two examples of the challenges that have arisen as a result of this failure. In terms of data, the evidence suggests that the West's response to Russian aggression has been inadequate. For instance, despite the imposition of sanctions, Russia's economy has continued to grow, and its military has become increasingly assertive. The data also show that the United States and its allies have failed to provide sufficient support to Ukraine, which has been forced to fight an ongoing war against Russian-backed separatists. Overall, David Sanger's analysis suggests that the West's struggle to defend itself against Russian aggression is a complex and ongoing challenge. The rise of China has created a new set of challenges for the United States and its allies, and the failure to respond effectively to Russian aggression has emboldened Putin and created an environment of increasing tension and conflict. As the data show, the West's response to Russian aggression has been inadequate, and a new approach is needed to address the challenges posed by Russia and China. Chapter 2. David Sanger notes that the rise of China as a global power has been a subject of interest and concern for the United States for several decades. In the 1990s, China's economic growth and potential for reform led to a period of engagement between the two nations. Robert Rubin, then Secretary of the Treasury, traveled to China in 1997, marking a significant shift in U.S. policy towards the country. The goal was to encourage China's integration into the global economy and promote economic freedom, with the assumption that this would lead to greater political freedom and stability. The data show that China's GDP growth averaged around 11% in the early 1990s, making it an attractive market for American businesses. However, China's per capita GDP was only $782, classifying it as a developing country. The U.S. government believed that by supporting China's entry into the World Trade Organization, WTO, the country would be encouraged to adopt Western-style laws and regulations, leading to greater economic and political liberalization. David Sanger explains that Vice Premier Zhu Rongji played a crucial role in China's economic reforms, pushing for market-oriented policies and greater openness to foreign investment. Zhu's efforts led to significant economic growth, with China's per capita GDP tripling by 2007 and again by 2017. However, this growth was accompanied by rising income inequality and concerns about China's increasing global influence. The U.S. government's approach to China during this period was shaped by the assumption that economic engagement would lead to political liberalization. President Bill Clinton believed that China's entry into the WTO would promote economic freedom and eventually lead to greater political freedom. However, this approach has been criticized for underestimating China's intentions and overestimating the power of economic engagement to drive political change. David Sanger highlights the example of China's accession to the WTO, which was facilitated by a trade deal negotiated by Charlene Barshevsky, the U.S. trade representative. The deal required China to make significant concessions, including opening up its markets to Western telecommunications, banking, and insurance firms. However, China's leaders were also cautious about the potential risks of opening up their economy, including the threat to state-owned industries and the potential for social unrest. The data suggest that China's economic growth has been accompanied by a significant increase in its military spending and global influence. China's military modernization has included the development of advanced technologies, such as anti-satellite missiles and cyber warfare capabilities. The U.S. government has responded to these developments with a mix of engagement and competition, seeking to promote cooperation on issues like trade and nonproliferation, while also addressing concerns about China's rising military power. David Sanger notes that the Obama administration's approach to China was shaped by a desire to promote cooperation and avoid confrontation. However, this approach was criticized for being too soft on China, particularly with regards to issues like human rights and intellectual property theft. The administration's Pivot to Asia policy aimed to strengthen U.S. ties with China's neighbors and promote a more balanced approach to the region. However, the policy was hindered by competing priorities, including the war in Afghanistan and the crisis in Ukraine. The example of China's Made in China 2025 initiative highlights the challenges facing the U.S. government in responding to China's rise. The initiative aims to promote China's domestic industries and reduce dependence on foreign technologies, posing a significant challenge to U.S. economic interests. The U.S. government has responded with a mix of measures, including tariffs and investment restrictions, aimed at promoting fair competition and protecting U.S. industries. David Sanger argues that the U.S. government's approach to China must take into account the complexities of the relationship and the challenges posed by China's rise. This requires a nuanced understanding of China's intentions and capabilities, as well as a willingness to promote cooperation and competition in equal measure. The U.S. government must also work to strengthen its alliances and partnerships in the region, promoting a more balanced and stable order in East Asia. Chapter 3. David Sanger notes that by the time Ukrainian comedian Volodymyr Zelensky created and starred in the TV show Servant of the People, Ukraine was already engaged in a constant low-grade war with Russia. The little green men had descended on the Crimean Peninsula, and everyone was certain they were Russian soldiers or mercenaries out of uniform, although Putin denied it. Later, he maintained that if they did happen to be Russians, they were patriots who had gone there of their own volition. However, when they raised a Russian flag in the Crimean Parliament building, he quickly annexed the whole peninsula. The annexation of Crimea was a clear violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, and the international community was slow to respond. David Sanger argues that the United States and its NATO allies were flying on autopilot, assuming that small course corrections would safely land the plane. The modest European sanctions and the refusal to send defensive weapons to Ukraine, such as Javelin anti-tank missiles, were insufficient to deter Russia. The data shows that the Russian economy continued to grow, and few wanted to declare that the American deterrent to further Russian action wasn't, in fact, a deterrent at all. The decision to go ahead with Nord Stream 2, a $10 billion plus pipeline project that would run from Russia to Germany, sent a message to Putin that invading Ukraine would have minimal consequences. David Sanger suggests that this decision was a green light for Putin to regroup and try again to bite off a chunk of Ukraine when conditions looked ripe. The United States failed to update its perception of who Putin was and where he was headed, assuming that his adventurism would be limited to seizing Crimea. However, Putin's changed risk calculus and his desire to remake the European order were underestimated. The Obama administration's response to the Russian invasion of Crimea was tepid, with a focus on sanctions and diplomatic pressure rather than military aid. David Sanger notes that the Pentagon's priority was China, 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 and Russia was seen as a disruptor, but not an existential threat. However, the events in Ukraine would eventually become a major challenge for the next president. Toward the end of Obama's time in office, the administration began circulating drafts of a new, top-secret Russia strategy, but it was too little, too late. The strategy was intended to leave a tougher approach for the next president, but it would ultimately be ignored by the Trump administration. The debate over whether to send defensive weapons to Ukraine was a contentious one, with some arguing that it would escalate the conflict and others arguing that it was necessary to deter Russia. David Sanger notes that the counterargument was that American weapons often fall into the wrong hands, especially in corrupt lands, and the javelins were just as likely to make their way to the pro-Russian forces. However, others argued that the lack of action would embolden Putin and allow him to continue his aggression in Ukraine. The rise of China and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia have significant implications for America's struggle to defend the West. David Sanger argues that the United States must reevaluate its approach to these challenges and develop a more effective strategy to counter the growing threats from Russia and China. The data suggests that the current approach is insufficient, and a new strategy is needed to address the changing global landscape. The failure to respond effectively to the invasion of Crimea has emboldened Putin, and the consequences of inaction will be severe if the United States does not develop a more robust approach to defending its interests and those of its allies. Chapter 4. David Sanger notes that the presidency of Donald Trump was marked by a significant shift in the global balance of power, with China's rise and Russia's invasion of Ukraine posing major challenges to American dominance. As the chapter highlights, Trump's National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, was a strong advocate for a more robust response to Russia's aggression, but his efforts were often hindered by the president's own views on the matter. According to data, Russia's military modernization and expansion into Eastern Europe were key concerns for McMaster, who believed that the United States was underestimating Russia's capabilities and willingness to use force. However, Trump's own views on Russia were influenced by his belief in the importance of personal relationships with foreign leaders, including Vladimir Putin. This approach was evident in Trump's decision to reverse course on sanctions against Russian companies, despite the concerns of his advisors. Meanwhile, China's rise was a major concern for Trump's administration, with many officials recognizing the need for a more comprehensive strategy to counter Beijing's growing economic and military power. David Sanger points out that the Trump administration's approach to China was marked by inconsistency and confusion, with different officials pursuing different agendas. While some, like Matt Pottinger, were pushing for a tougher line on China, others, like Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, were more focused on negotiating a trade deal. The data suggests that China's efforts to expand its influence in the world were multifaceted, including the use of economic coercion, cyber attacks, and disinformation campaigns. Despite these challenges, the Trump administration struggled to develop a coherent response, with the president's own views on China often at odds with those of his advisors. For example, Trump's decision to intervene in the case of Huawei, a Chinese telecommunications company, was seen as a major concession to Beijing and was widely criticized by his own officials. As David Sander notes, the Trump administration's approach to China was also influenced by the president's personal relationships with Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping. While some officials, like Pottinger, were pushing for a more confrontational approach, others, like Trump's daughter Ivanka, were more focused on building personal relationships with Chinese officials. The data suggests that this approach ultimately failed to yield significant results, with China continuing to expand its influence in the world. The chapter also highlights the role of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the broader struggle for global influence. According to David Sander, Trump's views on Ukraine were influenced by his belief that the country was corrupt and that the United States should not be involved in its affairs. However, this approach was at odds with the views of his advisors, who recognized the importance of supporting Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. The data suggests that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a significant test of American resolve, and that the Trump administration's response was ultimately inadequate. Overall, the chapter suggests that the Trump administration's approach to China and Russia was marked by inconsistency and confusion, with different officials pursuing different agendas. Despite the recognition of the significant challenges posed by these two powers, the administration struggled to develop a coherent response and ultimately failed to defend American interests in the region. As David Sander notes, this failure has significant implications for the future of American foreign policy and highlights the need for a more comprehensive and consistent approach to addressing the challenges posed by China and Russia. Chapter 5. David Sander notes that the year 2020 was marked by a series of significant events that would have far-reaching implications for global politics. According to data, the COVID-19 pandemic was still raging, and the U.S. presidential election was underway. In the midst of this chaos, a crucial event occurred that would set the stage for the unfolding drama. Kevin Mandia, the CEO of FireEye, a renowned cybersecurity firm, contacted Ann Neuberger at the National Security Agency with a cryptic message that something extremely sensitive had been discovered. The message prompted an immediate response from Neuberger, who had a background in counterintelligence and had worked on several high-profile cases, including the Edward Snowden revelations. Mandia's team had discovered that their company's most closely guarded tools, known as red teaming tools, had been stolen. These tools allowed the company to simulate cyber attacks on clients' networks, and their theft was a significant concern. As David Sander explains, the fact that someone could attack one of America's leading cybersecurity firms and walk off with their crown jewels was striking. Further investigation revealed that the culprit was likely the Russians, and their strategy was masterful. They had spent months figuring out how to break into SolarWinds software, which was used by thousands of clients, including government agencies and major corporations. The hackers had dropped malicious code into the software, which was then disseminated to clients through updates. This allowed them to pick and choose which victims to target, including the federal government. David Sander notes that the hackers' technique was simple but effective, taking advantage of SolarWinds' poor cybersecurity. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the Kremlin's cyber spies had succeeded in burrowing deep inside the federal government systems. The question on everyone's mind was whether the Russians were just using their access to spy or were positioning themselves to take over those systems. David Sander explains that the implications were far-reaching, with potential consequences for national security and the integrity of American democracy. The incident also highlighted the challenges facing the incoming Biden administration. With the Trump administration in its final weeks, there was a sense of chaos and uncertainty. The president's refusal to concede the election and his focus on denying Biden's victory meant that the transition was not being taken seriously. David Sanger notes that this lack of cooperation and communication would have significant consequences, particularly in terms of national security. The Biden administration faced a daunting task in responding to the SolarWinds hack and the broader challenges posed by Russia and China. The new president had to navigate a complex web of alliances and rivalries, all while dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic and the January 6 attack on the Capitol. David Sanger explains that the incident marked a turning point in the struggle to defend the West, highlighting the need for a coordinated response to the rising threats from China and Russia. As the Biden administration took office, there was a sense of uncertainty about the future. The new president had a long history of engagement with foreign leaders, but the world had changed dramatically since his time in the Senate. The rise of China and the resurgence of Russia posed significant challenges, and the U.S. was no longer the sole hyperpower. David Sanger notes that the era of superpowers throwing their weight around was ending, and something new and multipolar was emerging. In this context, the Biden administration's response to the SolarWinds hack and the broader challenges from China and Russia would be crucial. The new president had to balance the need to restore American credibility and leadership with the need to address the underlying issues that had led to the current state of affairs. David Sanger explains that this would require a fundamental shift in approach, one that recognized the changing nature of global politics and the need for a more coordinated and sustained response to emerging threats. Chapter 6. David Sanger notes that the United States is in the midst of a significant rethinking of its foreign policy, particularly with regards to China. The era of engagement with China has come to an end, and the debate now is over what comes next. This shift is evident in the changing tone of diplomatic interactions between the U.S. and China, as seen in the first in-person encounter between Chinese diplomats and the Biden administration in Anchorage. The meeting was marked by a more confrontational approach from the Chinese side, with Yang Jiechi, China's top diplomat, delivering a broadside against the U.S., citing its own democratic shortcomings and accusing it of trying to impose its values on others. The U.S., on the other hand, is seeking to reassert its influence in the region and counter China's growing power. David Sanger observes that the Biden administration is operating in a changed geopolitical environment, with China's diplomats now more willing to spar and threat. The U.S. is seeking to build alliances with other countries in the region and to invest in critical technologies, such as semiconductors, to reduce its dependence on China. This effort is part of a broader strategy to defend the West against China's rising power and to promote democratic values. The U.S. approach to China has undergone a significant shift in recent years, with a growing recognition that the old policy of engagement has failed to produce the desired results. David Sanger notes that the U.S. intelligence community has concluded that China is seeking to displace the U.S. as the world's leading power, and that its actions are driven by a desire to challenge American interests across the globe. The Biden administration is seeking to respond to this challenge through a combination of diplomatic, economic, and military means, including the imposition of sanctions and the development of new technologies. The role of Russia in this struggle is also significant, as David Sanger observes. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has highlighted the need for the U.S. and its allies to defend democratic values and to counter the growing influence of authoritarian powers. The U.S. is seeking to build a coalition of like-minded countries to counter the challenge posed by China and Russia, and to promote a rules-based international order. In this context, the concept of de-risking has emerged as a key strategy for the U.S., David Sanger notes. This involves reducing dependence on Chinese supply chains and promoting the development of domestic industries, particularly in critical technologies. The U.S. is also seeking to restrict China's access to sensitive technologies, such as advanced semiconductors, and to limit its ability to acquire U.S. companies with sensitive technologies. The Chinese response to these efforts has been robust, with diplomats such as Qin Gang, China's ambassador to the U.S., pushing back against U.S. criticism and promoting China's own narrative of peaceful development. David Sanger observes that the Chinese are seeking to portray themselves as the victims of U.S. aggression and to promote a narrative of U.S. decline. However, the U.S. is unlikely to back down, given its commitment to defending democratic values and promoting a rules-based international order. Overall, David Sanger's analysis suggests that the struggle between the U.S. and China is likely to be a long-term one, with significant implications for the future of the international order. The U.S. is seeking to defend its position as the world's leading power, while China is seeking to challenge its influence and promote its own values and interests. The outcome of this struggle will depend on a range of factors, including the ability of the U.S. to build alliances and promote democratic values, as well as the willingness of China to continue to challenge the existing international order. Chapter 7. David Sanger explains that the Biden administration has been clear about its desire for a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. However, this goal has been challenged by various incidents, including a ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline, which threatened to disrupt the U.S. energy supply. The attack, attributed to a Russian-based gang called Dark Side, highlighted the vulnerability of critical infrastructure to cyber threats. The incident occurred in May 2021, when a Colonial employee discovered a digital ransom note on the company's system, demanding millions of dollars in Bitcoin. The attack forced Colonial to shut down its pipeline, leading to a shortage of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel on the East Coast. The White House Situation Room was filled with aides trying to come up with alternatives to get gas moving across the country. David Sanger notes that the ransomware attack was a wake-up call for the U.S. government, highlighting the need for more effective measures to counter cyber threats. The incident demonstrated Russia's ability to shut down commerce and travel inside the U.S., and the Biden administration saw it as an opportunity to push back against Putin's aggression. The U.S. government has been struggling to respond to Russia's provocations, including the buildup of troops on the Ukrainian border. David Sanger explains that the U.S. has been trying to find a balance between deterring Russian aggression and avoiding escalation. The Biden administration has imposed sanctions on Russia, but these have had limited impact. The U.S. has also been working to strengthen its relationships with European and Asian partners to counter Russian influence. David Sanger notes that the U.S. has been providing military aid to Ukraine and has been working to improve its cybersecurity capabilities. The Geneva summit between Biden and Putin in June 2021 was a key moment in the U.S.-Russia relationship. David Sanger explains that the summit was focused on the threat of ransomware, with Biden warning Putin that the U.S. would take action if Russia did not crack down on cybercriminals operating from its territory. The summit was seen as a test of whether Putin would deliver on his promises to cooperate with the U.S. on cybersecurity issues. However, David Sanger notes that the summit was not a success in terms of resolving the underlying tensions between the U.S. and Russia. The U.S. has continued to face challenges from Russia, including the arrest of cybercriminals operating from Russian territory. The U.S. has also been working to improve its own cybersecurity capabilities, including the creation of a new cyber working group with Russia. The situation with Russia is complex, and David Sanger explains that the U.S. is struggling to defend the West against Russian aggression. The U.S. has been working to strengthen its alliances and improve its cybersecurity capabilities, but the challenge is significant. The rise of China has also added to the complexity of the situation, with the U.S. facing challenges from two major powers. David Sanger notes that the U.S. needs to find a way to manage the decline of Russia while also countering its aggression. The U.S. has been trying to find a balance between deterring Russian aggression and avoiding escalation, but it is a difficult challenge. The U.S. also needs to work with its European and Asian partners to counter Russian influence and improve cybersecurity capabilities. The data suggests that the U.S. is facing significant challenges in its efforts to defend the West against Russian aggression. The ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline was just one example of the types of threats that the U.S. is facing. David Sanger explains that the U.S. needs to improve its cybersecurity capabilities and work with its partners to counter Russian influence. The situation is complex, and the U.S. needs to find a way to manage the decline of Russia while also countering its aggression. Chapter 8. According to David Sanger, the collapse of the Afghan government and the rapid takeover by the Taliban marked a significant turning point in the global balance of power, with far-reaching implications for China's rise, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and America's struggle to defend the West. As the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan unfolded, the Chinese government watched with great interest, seeing an opportunity to expand its influence in the region and challenge American hegemony. The data suggests that China's leaders believe the U.S. has no stomach for the kind of international entanglements that have dominated the American century. David Sanger notes that the U.S. decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was driven by a desire to refocus on strategic interests that were deemed more vital, such as countering China's growing military and economic power. However, this move has been perceived by many as a sign of American weakness, emboldening China and other adversaries to challenge U.S. interests. The Chinese government has been actively courting the Taliban, seeking to expand its economic and strategic influence in the region, and potentially gaining access to Afghanistan's rich mineral resources. Meanwhile, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has further highlighted the challenges facing the U.S. and its allies in defending the West. David Sanger argues that the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan has undermined the credibility of American power, making it more difficult to deter Russian aggression in Eastern Europe. The data shows that Russia's military buildup along the Ukrainian border has been accompanied by a significant increase in disinformation and cyberattacks, aimed at weakening the Ukrainian government and undermining the resolve of the U.S. and its allies. The U.S. struggle to defend the West is further complicated by the rise of China, which is rapidly expanding its military capabilities and challenging American dominance in the Indo-Pacific region. David Sanger notes that the U.S. has been slow to respond to China's growing power, and that the withdrawal from Afghanistan has created an opportunity for China to fill the vacuum left by the U.S. The data suggests that China's military spending has increased significantly in recent years, with a focus on developing advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence, hypersonic missiles, and cyber warfare capabilities. In the face of these challenges, the U.S. and its allies must re-examine their strategy for defending the West. David Sanger argues that this will require a more nuanced understanding of the complex geopolitics at play, as well as a willingness to invest in the military and economic capabilities necessary to counter the rising power of China and the aggression of Russia. The data shows that the U.S. and its allies have a significant advantage in terms of military firepower and economic resources, but that these advantages are being eroded by the rising power of China and the growing assertiveness of Russia. Ultimately, the collapse of the Afghan government and the U.S. withdrawal from the country mark a significant turning point in the global balance of power. David Sanger notes that the U.S. and its allies must adapt to this new reality, recognizing that the struggle to defend the West will require a sustained commitment to military power, economic investment, and diplomatic engagement. The data suggests that the U.S. and its allies have the capabilities and resources to meet this challenge, but that it will require a newfound sense of urgency and purpose to counter the rising power of China and the aggression of Russia. Chapter 9. According to David Sanger, the relationship between China and the United States has become totally dysfunctional, with areas such as trade and technology requiring serious negotiation to avoid a separation into two economies, two sets of rules, and two internets. The United Nations Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, has stated that the current situation is one of confrontation, rather than cooperation. This shift is highlighted by China's recent hypersonic weapons test, which has sent shockwaves through the Pentagon and the intelligence community. The test, which involved a missile flying in the wrong direction, has raised concerns about China's military capabilities and the potential threat to the United States. General John Hyten, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has stated that the test was a Sputnik moment, referencing the 1957 launch of the Soviet satellite that sparked the space race. The test has also sparked a debate about the United States' ability to defend against hypersonic weapons, with some arguing that the country is 4 to 5 years behind China in developing similar capabilities. David Sanger notes that the hypersonic test is not the only example of China's growing military capabilities. The country has also been developing new nuclear missile silos, with satellite images showing fields of new silos being constructed in the desert. This expansion of China's nuclear arsenal has significant implications for the United States, which will now have to think about defending against two major nuclear powers with arsenals roughly the size of its own. The message of the new silos is that China is sending a signal to the United States, and the construction of the silos is likely intended to be discovered. The rise of China's military capabilities is not limited to hypersonic weapons and nuclear missiles. The country has also been developing new technologies, such as robotic satellite technology with a giant grappling arm that could seize and move an entire satellite. This technology has sparked concerns about the potential for China to disable America's own satellites, and has fueled the narrative of an ambitious China preparing to displace the United States in old military domains and new ones. In response to China's growing military capabilities, the United States has been seeking to strengthen its alliances in the region. The recent deal with Australia to build nuclear submarines is an example of this, with the submarines intended to patrol the South Pacific and counter China's territorial ambitions in Asia. However, the deal has also sparked a diplomatic spat with France, which had a pre-existing contract to supply Australia with submarines. The incident highlights the brutal calculus involved in shifting America's focus to Asia, and the need for the United States to prioritize its relationships with key allies in the region. David Sanger argues that the current standoff between the United States and China is fundamentally different from the Cold War. The deep links between the two economies, with mutual dependencies on technology, trade, and information, mean that the conflict is more complex and multifaceted. The United States is no longer facing a single, monolithic adversary, but rather a range of different challenges and threats. The era of American preeminence in space is ending, and the country is facing a new class of weapons that will force a rethinking of its nuclear strategy. The situation is further complicated by the fact that China is not the only adversary that the United States is facing. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has sparked concerns about the potential for a new Cold War, and the United States is struggling to defend the West against a range of different threats. The dynamic among three nuclear powers, the United States, China, and Russia, is substantially more complicated than that between two, and the old rules of deterrence are no longer applicable. The United States is facing a new era of nuclear instability, with the potential for a slow burn to a new arms race. Data shows that the successful interception rate of hypersonic missiles remains far lower than initially hoped, and the world's very first working hypersonic weapon, the V-2 rocket, was built with concentration camp forced labor and deployed to devastating effect over the city of London in 1944. The estimates of China's nuclear arsenal do not include short-range, tactical nuclear weapons being deployed opposite Taiwan, highlighting the complexity and unpredictability of the situation. Chapter 10. David Sanger delves into the intricate dynamics surrounding China's rise, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and America's struggle to defend the West. The chapter begins with the Biden administration's efforts to navigate the complex relationships between these global powers. Victoria Nuland, a key figure in the administration, was suspected by Putin of plotting against Russian ambitions for nearly 2 decades. Her appointment as the State Department's No. 3 official was seen as a symbol of the government's tough stance on Russia. The chapter highlights the failed attempts at diplomacy between the U.S. and Russia, including Nuland's trip to Moscow in October 2021. David Sanger notes that Nuland's meeting with Sergei Ryabkov, the Russian deputy foreign minister, was unsuccessful, with Ryabkov being formal and cold. The meeting with Dmitry Kozak, the deputy chief of staff for the Kremlin, was even more unproductive, with Kozak smoking cigarettes in Nuland's face and refusing to back down. The data presented in the chapter suggests that Russia's buildup of troops along the Ukrainian border was a significant concern for the U.S. and its allies. General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was briefed on the growing pattern of intelligence that suggested Putin was contemplating a major military invasion of Ukraine. The intelligence community was split on Putin's intentions, but the accumulating evidence pointed to a full-scale invasion. David Sanger explains that the Biden administration's strategy to deter Putin involved a combination of secret and public efforts. The secret effort involved deploying Bill Burns, the CIA director, to Moscow to warn Putin of the consequences of an invasion. The public effort involved making public the American intelligence findings to expose Putin's plans and muster a united resolve among Western allies. The chapter also touches on the topic of China's rise and its implications for global security. David Sanger notes that China's leaders see the reunification of Taiwan as a top priority, similar to Putin's desire to control Ukraine. The U.S. and its allies are walking a fine line in their relationships with both China and Russia, trying to balance their economic and strategic interests with the need to defend their values and security. The data presented in the chapter highlights the challenges faced by the U.S. and its allies in responding to Russia's aggression. The U.S. intelligence community was aware of the Russian military's plans, but the Europeans were skeptical, drawing comparisons to the intelligence failures surrounding the Iraq War. The U.S. had to rely on a combination of diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and military preparedness to deter Putin. David Sanger concludes that the U.S. and its allies were ultimately unable to prevent Putin's invasion of Ukraine. However, the administration's efforts to expose Putin's plans and build a united front among Western allies may have slowed down the invasion and prevented Russia from seizing the narrative. The chapter ends with a sense of uncertainty, as the world waits to see how the conflict will unfold and what the implications will be for global security. Chapter 11. The partnership between China and Russia has been a subject of much debate, with some viewing it as a mere alliance of convenience, while others see it as a significant threat to the American-led international order. As David Sanger notes, the relationship between the two nations has been complex and nuanced, with a history of cooperation and conflict. The 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing marked a significant moment in this partnership, as Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met to discuss their shared interests and release a joint statement outlining their vision for a new world order. According to David Sanger, the statement, which declared that the friendship between China and Russia had no limits, sent shockwaves around the world, particularly in the United States and Europe. The declaration was seen as a challenge to the existing international order, with many wondering if China would back Russia's invasion of Ukraine with arms, ammunition, and political clout. David Sanger explains that the partnership between China and Russia is driven by a shared interest in challenging the American-led order, with both nations seeking to expand their influence and power. The history of the China-Russia relationship is marked by periods of cooperation and conflict, as David Sanger points out. In the early days of the Cold War, China and the Soviet Union were allies, with Mao Zedong seeking to lean to one side in his foreign policy decision-making. However, the relationship was marked by tensions and mistrust, with Mao and Soviet leaders such as Nikita Khrushchev clashing over issues such as nuclear cooperation and the role of communism in the world. The Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s marked a significant turning point in the relationship, with China and the Soviet Union engaging in a series of border clashes and ideological disputes. In recent years, however, the relationship between China and Russia has undergone a significant transformation, as David Sanger notes. The two nations have found common ground in their opposition to the American-led order, with Xi and Putin seeking to expand their influence and power through a series of joint economic and military initiatives. The 2022 joint statement marked a significant moment in this partnership, with China and Russia declaring their intention to work together on a range of issues, from trade and energy to security and defense. The implications of this partnership are far-reaching, as David Sanger explains. The United States and its allies are concerned that a China-Russia alliance could pose a significant challenge to the existing international order, with the two nations seeking to expand their influence and power at the expense of the West. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has marked a significant escalation of this conflict, with China's response being closely watched by the international community. According to data, the partnership between China and Russia has the potential to be a game-changer in the geopolitical landscape, with significant implications for the United States and its allies. As David Sanger points out, the United States has been slow to recognize the significance of the China-Russia partnership, with many officials viewing it as a mere alliance of convenience. However, the 2022 joint statement and the Russian invasion of Ukraine have marked a significant wake-up call, with the United States and its allies seeking to respond to the growing challenge posed by China and Russia. The struggle to defend the West is likely to be a long and complex one, with the United States and its allies facing significant challenges in the years ahead. David Sanger notes that the partnership between China and Russia is a key aspect of this struggle, with the two nations seeking to expand their influence and power through a series of joint economic and military initiatives. The intelligence community has also been examining the partnership between China and Russia, as David Sanger explains. According to data, the Chinese intelligence service is strong in certain areas, such as technical collection, but weak in others, including assessing the intent of foreign leadership. This lack of understanding of Putin's intent was evident in the lead-up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with China apparently missing the signs of an imminent attack. The Chinese services also have a tendency to tell their leadership what they think they want to hear, which can lead to a distorted view of reality. As a result, the Chinese shared the intel they received from the United States with Moscow, highlighting the close relationship between the two nations. Chapter 12. David Sanger's analysis of the events leading up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine reveals a complex web of diplomatic efforts, military preparations, and cyber operations. In the months preceding the invasion, the U.S. government was aware of Russia's plans, with officials like Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan working to convince allies of the impending threat. Meanwhile, the U.S. Cyber National Mission Force was deployed to Ukraine to identify vulnerabilities in the country's government and critical infrastructure networks. As David Sanger notes, the U.S. team, led by Marine Corps Major Sharon Rowlands, conducted a hunt-forward operation to help the Ukrainians strengthen their cybersecurity. This effort was part of a broader strategy to prepare Ukraine for a potential Russian invasion, which included providing military aid and training to the Ukrainian military. The U.S. government was particularly concerned about the possibility of a Russian cyber attack, which could cripple Ukraine's ability to respond to an invasion. In the event, the Russian invasion began with a cyber attack on Ukraine's communication networks, including the Viasat satellite network. However, the Ukrainians were able to recover quickly, thanks in part to the help of companies like SpaceX, which provided Starlink terminals to restore communication links. According to David Sanger, this was a crucial factor in Ukraine's ability to resist the Russian invasion, as it allowed the military to coordinate its response and maintain communication with the government. The Russian invasion itself was marked by a series of mistakes and miscalculations, including the failure to take control of the skies and the underestimation of Ukrainian resistance. As David Sanger points out, the Russian military had invested heavily in advanced hardware, but its forces were unable to effectively integrate these systems on the battlefield. The Russian military's performance was also hindered by corruption and a lack of preparation, which led to logistical problems and a failure to provide adequate supplies to troops. Despite these challenges, the Russian military was able to achieve some successes, particularly in the use of cyber warfare. The attack on the Viasat network was a significant blow to Ukraine's communication capabilities, and it highlighted the vulnerability of satellite networks to cyberattacks. However, as David Sanger notes, the Ukrainians were able to adapt and find alternative means of communication, which limited the impact of the attack. The U.S. response to the invasion was shaped by a combination of factors, including the need to support Ukraine, the desire to avoid escalating the conflict, and the requirement to coordinate with European allies. As David Sanger reports, the U.S. government provided significant military aid to Ukraine, including Javelin anti-tank missiles and Stinger missiles. The U.S. also worked to coordinate a united Western response to the invasion, which included imposing sanctions on Russia and providing economic support to Ukraine. In the end, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a major turning point in the struggle to defend the West. As David Sanger observes, the invasion marked a significant escalation of Russia's efforts to challenge the international order, and it highlighted the need for the U.S. and its allies to prepare for a new era of great power competition. The conflict also underscored the importance of cybersecurity and the need for governments and companies to work together to protect against cyber threats. According to data, the impact of the invasion was felt far beyond Ukraine, with significant economic and political consequences for Russia and the wider region. Chapter 13. David Sanger delves into the complexities of international relations, particularly the dynamics between China, Russia, and the United States. The chapter explores how these nations navigate their interests, alliances, and conflicts, with a focus on China's rise, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and America's struggle to defend the West. According to data, China's increasing economic and military power has significant implications for the global balance of power. David Sanger notes that China's rise is a crucial factor in the United States' calculations, as it seeks to maintain its influence in the region. The U.S. is faced with the challenge of managing its relationships with both China and Russia, while also addressing the security concerns of its allies. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia has further complicated the geopolitical landscape. David Sanger explains that the U.S. has been providing significant military aid to Ukraine, including advanced weapon systems, to help the country defend itself against Russian aggression. However, this support has also raised concerns about the potential for escalation and the risk of direct conflict between the U.S. and Russia. The concept of boiling the frog is used to describe the U.S. strategy of gradually increasing its support for Ukraine, while avoiding sudden and provocative actions that could trigger a Russian response. David Sanger argues that this approach is designed to allow Ukraine to build its defenses and gain an advantage over Russian forces, without prompting Putin to launch a wider war. Despite these efforts, the conflict in Ukraine continues to pose significant challenges for the U.S. and its allies. David Sanger notes that the war has had a profound impact on European security, with many countries reevaluating their relationships with Russia and seeking to strengthen their defenses. The U.S. has also faced criticism for its handling of the crisis, with some arguing that it has not done enough to support Ukraine or deter Russian aggression. The passing of Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, serves as a reminder of the significant changes that have taken place in the post-Cold War era. David Sanger observes that Gorbachev's legacy is complex, with some viewing him as a champion of democracy and others seeing him as responsible for the decline of Russian power. Putin's response to Gorbachev's death, which included a statement acknowledging his impact on world history, is seen as an attempt to co-opt his legacy and justify his own actions. Throughout the chapter, David Sanger draws on a range of sources, including data and interviews with key officials, to provide a detailed analysis of the complex geopolitical dynamics at play. The discussion highlights the challenges faced by the U.S. as it seeks to navigate its relationships with China and Russia, while also defending its interests and alliances in the region. As the situation continues to evolve, it is clear that the U.S. will need to balance its competing priorities and develop a coherent strategy for addressing the rising tensions between major powers. Chapter 14. David Sanger notes that the visit of Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, to Taiwan in August 2022 was a significant event that highlighted the complexities of the relationship between the United States, China, and Taiwan. The visit was seen as a challenge to China's claim of sovereignty over Taiwan, and it sparked a strong reaction from the Chinese government. According to data, the visit was closely monitored by the Chinese military, and it led to a significant increase in military exercises and missile launches by China in the Taiwan Strait. The context of the visit was also significant, as it came at a time when the United States was already engaged in a struggle to defend its interests in the face of China's rising power and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. David Sanger argues that the visit was a test of the United States' commitment to defending Taiwan, and it raised questions about the effectiveness of the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity towards the island. The data suggests that the U.S. has maintained a delicate balance of support for Taiwan, refusing to clarify exactly how it would come to the island's defense in the event of a Chinese invasion. The visit also highlighted the challenges faced by the United States in its relations with China, particularly in the context of China's rising power and its increasing assertiveness in the region. David Sanger notes that China's economic growth and military expansion have created a new dynamic in the region, and the United States is struggling to respond to these changes. The data shows that China's military modernization has been rapid, with significant investments in new technologies and capabilities, and this has created a sense of urgency in the United States about the need to strengthen its own military presence in the region. The reaction of the Chinese government to the visit was also significant, as it highlighted the tensions between the United States and China over Taiwan. David Sanger argues that the Chinese government saw the visit as a challenge to its sovereignty and a threat to its national interests, and it responded with a series of military exercises and diplomatic protests. The data suggests that the Chinese government is becoming increasingly assertive in its claims to Taiwan, and this is creating a sense of uncertainty and instability in the region. The implications of the visit are also significant, as they highlight the challenges faced by the United States in its relations with China and Taiwan. David Sanger notes that the visit has raised questions about the effectiveness of the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan, and it has created a sense of uncertainty about the future of the region. The data suggests that the United States needs to develop a more coherent and consistent policy towards Taiwan, one that takes into account the changing dynamics of the region and the rising power of China. In terms of the broader context, David Sanger argues that the visit is part of a larger struggle between the United States and China for influence and power in the region. The data shows that China's rise has created a new dynamic in the region, with significant implications for the United States and its allies. The visit has highlighted the need for the United States to develop a more effective strategy for competing with China, one that takes into account the changing dynamics of the region and the rising power of China. The visit has also raised questions about the role of the United States in defending its allies and partners in the region. David Sanger notes that the visit has highlighted the challenges faced by the United States in its relations with Taiwan, and it has created a sense of uncertainty about the future of the region. The data suggests that the United States needs to develop a more coherent and consistent policy towards Taiwan, one that takes into account the changing dynamics of the region and the rising power of China. Overall, the visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan has highlighted the complexities and challenges of the relationship between the United States, China, and Taiwan. David Sanger argues that the visit has raised significant questions about the effectiveness of the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan, and it has created a sense of uncertainty about the future of the region. The data suggests that the United States needs to develop a more coherent and consistent policy towards Taiwan, one that takes into account the changing dynamics of the region and the rising power of China. Chapter 15. David Sanger notes that the world is facing a critical moment in modern history, with China's rise and Russia's invasion of Ukraine posing significant challenges to the West. According to data, the threat of nuclear war is higher than it has been in decades, with Russian President Vladimir Putin issuing veiled threats to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. This has prompted concerns among Western leaders, including U.S. President Joe Biden, who has spoken candidly about the risks of nuclear war. The situation is complex, with China's growing military and economic power adding to the tensions. David Sanger points out that China's leader, Xi Jinping, has been careful not to explicitly support Russia's actions in Ukraine, but has also refused to condemn them. This has led to concerns that China may be emboldened to pursue its own territorial claims in the region, potentially leading to further conflict. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has also highlighted the importance of nuclear diplomacy, with the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, playing a key role in preventing the use of nuclear weapons. David Sanger notes that the IAEA's chief, Rafael Grossi, has been working to prevent a nuclear disaster at the Zaporizhia power plant in Ukraine, which has been occupied by Russian forces. Grossi's efforts have been hindered by the lack of access to the plant, as well as the risk of shelling and other military activity in the area. Despite these challenges, David Sanger argues that the U.S. and its allies have been working to strengthen their relationships with other countries, including China and India, in an effort to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. The U.S. has also been providing significant military aid to Ukraine, including advanced weapon systems, in an effort to help the country defend itself against Russian aggression. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 provides a useful historical precedent for understanding the current crisis, David Sanger notes. During that crisis, the U.S. and the Soviet Union came close to nuclear war over the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba. The crisis was ultimately resolved through a combination of diplomacy and compromise, with the Soviet Union agreeing to withdraw its missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade the island. In the current crisis, David Sanger argues that the U.S. and its allies must be careful to avoid provoking Russia into using nuclear weapons. This requires a delicate balance between supporting Ukraine's defense efforts and avoiding actions that could be seen as provocative by Russia. The U.S. has been working to establish clear communication channels with Russia, including through the use of intermediaries such as Turkey, in an effort to reduce the risk of miscalculation. Ultimately, David Sanger concludes that the current crisis highlights the need for a new era of diplomacy and cooperation between the U.S., China, and Russia. The threat of nuclear war is too great to be ignored and requires a concerted effort to prevent. By working together, the major powers can reduce the risk of conflict and create a more stable and secure world. The situation in Ukraine remains volatile, with ongoing fighting and a significant humanitarian crisis. David Sanger notes that the U.S. and its allies must continue to provide support to Ukraine, while also working to establish a peaceful resolution to the conflict. This will require careful diplomacy and a willingness to compromise, as well as a commitment to preventing the use of nuclear weapons. In terms of China's role in the crisis, David Sanger argues that the country's growing power and influence make it a critical player in preventing the use of nuclear weapons. China's leader, Xi Jinping, has been careful to maintain a balance between his country's relationships with the US and Russia, while also pursuing China's own interests in the region. The US and its allies must be careful to engage with China in a way that takes into account its growing power and influence, while also preventing the country from pursuing actions that could destabilize the region. Overall, David Sanger's analysis highlights the complexity and volatility of the current crisis, and the need for careful diplomacy and cooperation to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. The situation requires a deep understanding of the historical context, as well as a commitment to preventing the use of nuclear weapons and promoting a more stable and secure world. Chapter 16. David Sanger explains that the world's reliance on Taiwan for advanced computer chips has become a critical issue, with the island producing nearly 90% of the most modern chips used globally. This has created a complex situation, as China's vow to reunify with Taiwan has raised concerns about the potential disruption to the global supply chain. The Silicon Shield theory suggests that China would not risk destroying TSMC, the Taiwanese company that produces these chips, as it relies heavily on them for its own economy. However, this theory may not hold up, as China's leader Xi Jinping has shown willingness to prioritize security interests over economic concerns. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the vulnerability of the global supply chain, with chip fabrication plants shutting down and cargo flights being canceled, leading to a shortage of chips for various products, including cars and electronics. According to data, the pandemic exposed the weaknesses in the supply chain, and policymakers began to realize the need to reduce dependence on Taiwan and diversify chip production. David Sanger notes that the US has been trying to rebuild its domestic chip manufacturing capacity, with the Biden administration championing the CHIPS Act, which provides funding for companies like Intel to build new facilities in the US. However, the process has been slow, and Intel's CEO, Pat Gelsinger, has been pushing for government backing to offset the high cost of building new facilities in the US. The CHIPS Act finally passed in 2022, but the effort has been criticized for being too little, too late. David Sanger argues that the US needs to move faster to reduce its dependence on long and tenuous overseas supply chains for critical technologies like chips. The US government has also been working to restrict China's access to advanced chips and chip-making equipment, with the Commerce Department imposing new rules in October 2022 to block the sale of advanced chips to China. The rules have been met with resistance from American companies, including NVIDIA, which has designed new chips that fall just below the speed limits established by the Commerce Department. David Sanger explains that the situation is complex, with China determined to develop its own chip-making capabilities, and the US trying to stay ahead in the technology race. The Netherlands has played a crucial role in this effort, with the company ASML producing the most advanced lithography machines used in chip production. The Dutch government has been working with the US to restrict the export of these machines to China, but China is determined to find its own way to develop advanced chips. The US has been trying to build a high fence around its critical technologies, but David Sanger notes that this is a challenging task, given the complex global supply chain and China's determination to catch up. The situation is further complicated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has highlighted the need for the US and its allies to defend their technological edge. As David Sanger explains, the US is struggling to defend the West against the rise of China and the aggression of Russia, and the issue of chip production is just one example of the complex challenges that lie ahead. According to data, the global chip supply chain is intertwined with the economies of multiple countries, making it a critical issue for international relations and global security. Chapter 17. David Sanger notes that the United States is facing a complex challenge in defending the West against China's rise and Russia's invasion. This challenge is multifaceted, with various factors at play. On one hand, China is expanding its influence globally, making strategic investments and forming alliances with other nations. On the other hand, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has created a new dynamic, with China potentially providing military aid to Russia. The data suggests that China's economic growth and military expansion have been significant in recent years. According to the information, China has made great strides in making full use of what Pentagon strategists call all elements of national power. This includes reinvigorating the BRICS grouping, which pulls together Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa in an economic partnership that excludes the United States and other Western powers. David Sanger argues that China's strategy is driven by a desire to mold events at home and around the world. The country has deployed its white-hulled Coast Guard ships into disputed sea lanes, making the case that it is protecting commerce while staking a territorial claim. Additionally, China has persuaded American allies like Poland and the Philippines to join the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, backed by the Chinese government as an alternative to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The situation in the Solomon Islands is a prime example of China's expanding influence. The country's prime minister, Manasseh Sogavare, has signed a new security pact with Beijing, which has raised concerns in Washington. David Sanger notes that the pact allows China to bring in its armed forces and military police to protect its interests, giving Beijing another military foothold in the region. The data also suggests that China's investment in the South Pacific has been significant, with the country's investments skyrocketing from $900 million to $4.5 billion between 2013 and 2018. This investment has come at a cost, with many countries struggling to pay back debts to China. The example of Sri Lanka, which handed over a key port to a Chinese company with a 99-year lease, has raised concerns about China's debt-trap diplomacy. In response to China's rise, the United States has been trying to counter the country's influence. David Sanger notes that the Biden administration has been working to create purpose-built groupings, not true alliances, through the region. This includes elevating the Quad and convincing India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, to become a central player. The United States has also been trying to invest in people and development, such as meeting basic needs, energy independence, transferring skills, and democratic freedoms. The situation in Ukraine has added a new dynamic to the challenge facing the United States. David Sanger argues that China's potential provision of military aid to Russia could have a significant impact on the conflict. The data suggests that American intelligence officials have warned that China's military aid could be disguised as civilian equipment and sent to Russia on planes, trains, and ships. The meeting between Wang Yi and Blinken in Munich highlights the tensions between the United States and China. Wang's response to the destruction of the spy balloon was seen as defensive, with the Chinese official accusing the United States of using all its means to clamp down and smear China. David Sanger notes that the conversation between Wang and Blinken went downhill, with the two sides leaving the session as far apart and as distrustful as ever. Overall, David Sanger's analysis suggests that the United States is facing a significant challenge in defending the West against China's rise and Russia's invasion. The data highlights the complexity of the issue, with various factors at play, including China's economic growth, military expansion, and strategic investments. The situation in the Solomon Islands and Ukraine adds a new dynamic to the challenge, with the potential for China to provide military aid to Russia and expand its influence in the region. Chapter 18. David Sanger explains that the situation in Ukraine is becoming increasingly complex, with America and its allies sending more support to Ukraine than anyone could have imagined. Yet they are increasingly divided over what should be sent, when, and how much. The struggle over sending tanks is just one example of this division. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz was initially reluctant to send German-made Leopard 2 tanks, citing concerns about the imagery of German tanks rolling eastward toward the capital cities they had crushed some 80 years before. This reluctance was not unique to Scholz, as anti-war elements in Germany also had concerns about sending tanks. According to David Sanger, the Ukrainians were in dire need of tanks, particularly the Leopard 2 and the American M1 Abrams, to pierce Russian defenses and traverse trenches and other obstacles. However, the Russians had already lost a significant number of tanks, and the Ukrainians were rapidly depleting Western stocks of bullets and missiles. The arrival of the Leopard tanks was crucial, but it was not without its challenges, as the older tanks were largely not battle-worthy after decades in storage. David Sanger notes that the training of Ukrainian troops was also a critical aspect of the war effort. At the Grafenwoher training area in Bavaria, Germany, hundreds of Ukrainian troops were being trained by Western counterparts in the use of new weapons and combined arms warfare. The goal was to enable the Ukrainians to integrate different types of weapons and operations, utilizing infantry and armored units together or complementing on-the-ground warfare with air support. However, the Ukrainians were starting from scratch, with some 60 to 70% of the trainers estimating that they had never been around artillery before. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, stated that every war has two endgames. The first is when the guns are silent and the enemy leaves the territory, while the second is a long endgame that ensures the aggressor is not capable of repeating the aggression. This sentiment was echoed by Lloyd Austin, who believed that the goal of the West was to see Russia weaken to the degree that it could not do the kinds of things it had done in invading Ukraine. However, this goal was not without its challenges, as Putin's grip on power remained strong and the Russian economy had held up despite sanctions. David Sanger explains that the situation was further complicated by the involvement of other nations, including China. While China had not provided direct military support to Russia, it had bought Russian oil and had been cautious in its response to the invasion. India, on the other hand, had been adamant that the West's problems were not its concern and had refused to sanction Russia. This ambivalence towards the war was not unique to India, as many countries around the world had abstained from criticizing Russia, citing concerns about their own borders and national interests. The visit of President Biden to Kyiv was a significant moment in the war, as it sent a strong signal to Putin that the West was committed to supporting Ukraine. However, the visit was not without its risks, as Biden had to travel without American troops on the ground, relying on a skeleton staff and a special forces team just over the border. The visit was also notable for its timing, as it coincided with Putin's speech to the Russian Federal Assembly, in which he doubled down on the war and the narrative that it had been started by the West. David Sanger notes that the war had also led to a significant shift in the global balance of power, with Finland and Sweden applying to join NATO and the Baltic Sea becoming a critical frontline in the conflict. The Finnish president, Sauli Niinistö, had played a key role in this shift, as he had moved his country firmly into the Western camp despite initial reluctance. The decision to join NATO was driven by a realization that the era of straddling the line between Moscow and the West had come to an end, and that Finland's security depended on its ability to maximize its relationships with both sides. The war had also led to a growing divide within Europe, with some countries beginning to fracture internally over the question of whether this should really be the West's war. In Germany, for example, a counter-protest was held in Berlin, with socialist and anti-war politicians calling on the government to stop the escalation of arms deliveries. The protest was notable for its alignment with far-right forces and pro-Putin sympathizers, highlighting the complexities of the conflict and the challenges of building a unified response to Russia's invasion. Chapter 19. David Sanger notes that the digital war in Ukraine has been a testing ground for new technologies and strategies, with the U.S. and its allies providing significant support to the Ukrainian military. The PIT, a secret intelligence gathering center, has played a crucial role in collecting and analyzing data from various sources, including commercial satellite companies, social media, and encrypted communications apps. This data is then used to create a single pane of glass, a comprehensive and constantly updated map of the war on the ground. The U.S. has walked a fine line in providing support to Ukraine, with officials careful not to cross the line into actively providing targeting data. As David Sanger reports, the U.S. has instead focused on helping the Ukrainians understand the threats they face, with the goal of enabling them to defend themselves. This approach has been likened to the U.S. support for the U.K. during World War II, with the U.S. providing intelligence and other forms of assistance without directly engaging in combat. The Ukrainian military has also been actively developing its own technologies and strategies, including the use of drones and other unmanned systems. David Sanger notes that Ukraine has become a laboratory for the development of new military technologies, with the U.S. and other countries taking note of the innovations being developed on the battlefield. The Ukrainians have been able to leverage commercial technologies, such as 3D printing and social media, to support their military efforts, and have also developed their own systems for gathering and analyzing intelligence. The conflict in Ukraine has also highlighted the importance of electronic warfare, with both sides engaging in efforts to disrupt each other's command and control systems. The Russians have been using electronic warfare to jam Ukrainian communications and disrupt their ability to coordinate their military efforts, while the Ukrainians have been using their own electronic warfare capabilities to counter these efforts. David Sanger reports that the U.S. has been providing support to the Ukrainians in this area, including the provision of advanced communication systems and other technologies. The war in Ukraine has also underscored the challenges facing the U.S. and its allies in defending against Russian aggression. David Sanger notes that the U.S. has been struggling to keep pace with the rapidly evolving nature of the conflict, with the Russians adapting quickly to new technologies and strategies. The U.S. has been working to develop its own new technologies and strategies, including the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning, but these efforts are still in their early stages. Meanwhile, China has been watching the conflict in Ukraine with great interest and has been drawing its own lessons from the war. David Sanger reports that China has been investing heavily in new military technologies, including hypersonics and other advanced systems, and has been seeking to develop its own capabilities in areas such as electronic warfare and cybersecurity. The U.S. and its allies are increasingly concerned about the implications of China's rising military power and are seeking to develop new strategies for defending against Chinese aggression. The role of private companies, such as SpaceX and Palantir, has also been significant in the conflict in Ukraine. David Sanger notes that these companies have been providing critical support to the Ukrainian military, including the provision of advanced communication systems and other technologies. However, this has also raised concerns about the potential risks and challenges associated with relying on private companies for military support, including the potential for conflicts of interest and the lack of transparency and accountability. Overall, the conflict in Ukraine has highlighted the rapidly evolving nature of modern warfare and the challenges facing the U.S. and its allies in defending against Russian and Chinese aggression. David Sanger's reporting suggests that the U.S. and its allies will need to continue to innovate and adapt in order to stay ahead of these challenges, and that the development of new technologies and strategies will be critical to success in this effort. Data from various sources, including social media and commercial satellite companies, will play a key role in this effort, providing critical insights and intelligence to support military operations. Chapter 20. The downward spiral of global events has been a subject of great concern for David Sanger, who has been closely following the developments in the United States, China, and Russia. According to data, the relationship between the United States and China has been deteriorating, with tensions rising over issues such as trade, technology, and security. David Sanger notes that the Chinese economy has been slowing down, and the country's leadership is facing significant challenges, including a rapidly aging population and a decline in economic growth. The Chinese government's response to these challenges has been to increase its military presence and assert its claims in the South China Sea. which has led to concerns among its neighbors and the United States. David Sanger points out that the United States has been trying to counter China's rise by strengthening its alliances with other countries in the region and investing in new technologies, such as artificial intelligence and biotechnology. However, the United States is also struggling to defend its own interests, as evidenced by the ongoing trade war with China and the challenges posed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The conflict in Ukraine has been a major concern for the United States and its European allies, who have imposed significant sanctions on Russia in an attempt to pressure it to withdraw its forces. David Sanger notes that the war has had significant humanitarian and economic consequences, with thousands of people killed and millions displaced. The war has also had a major impact on the global economy, with trade disrupted and energy prices soaring. Despite the challenges posed by China and Russia, the United States remains committed to defending its interests and those of its allies. David Sanger points out that the United States has been working to strengthen its relationships with other countries in the region, including Japan and South Korea, and has been investing in new technologies such as hypersonic missiles and cyber warfare capabilities. However, the United States is also facing significant challenges, including a declining defense budget and a lack of clarity about its strategic priorities. The situation in the Middle East is also a major concern for the United States, with the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine posing a significant challenge to regional stability. David Sanger notes that the United States has been trying to broker a peace agreement between the two sides, but the talks have been stalled for several years. The conflict has had significant humanitarian consequences, with thousands of people killed and millions displaced. In terms of China's rise, David Sanger notes that the country's economic growth has been slowing down, and its leadership is facing significant challenges, including a rapidly aging population and a decline in economic growth. The Chinese government has responded to these challenges by increasing its military presence and asserting its claims in the South China Sea, which has led to concerns among its neighbors and the United States. The United States has been trying to counter China's rise by strengthening its alliances with other countries in the region and investing in new technologies, such as artificial intelligence and biotechnology. However, the United States is also struggling to defend its own interests, as evidenced by the ongoing trade war with China and the challenges posed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Overall, David Sanger's analysis suggests that the global situation is complex and challenging, with multiple crises and conflicts posing significant threats to regional and global stability. The United States, China, and Russia are all major players in this drama, and their actions will have significant consequences for the future of the world. According to data, the relationship between these countries will continue to evolve, with significant implications for global security and stability.
Hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe.